The year is 1945. It is the dead of night, out in the middle of the desolate New Mexico desert. And you are staring out through the windshield of a military transport truck. Suddenly, the sky literally tears open. The entire horizon is engulfed in a terrifying, blinding purple splotch of light. The heat of 1,000 suns rolls right over the truck. This is the Trinity test. The detonation of the very first atomic bomb. Anyone in their right mind out there is wearing heavy, dark welding glasses. Standard safety protocol to protect their retinas from being instantly scorched. But not the young man sitting in this particular truck. He is in his mid-20s. And he is staring at the birth of the nuclear age with his naked eyes. He had reasoned his way out of the safety rules. He ran the calculations in his head and figured out that the silica in the truck's windshield would naturally block the harmful ultraviolet rays. He wanted to see the unvarnished reality of what he had helped create. Without any filter at all, just pure, raw calculation. Right in the face of absolute doomsday. But here is the cinematic contrast that we must sit with today. Just a short drive away from that scorched desert. The absolute love of his life, a woman he married fully knowing she was terminally ill, had just died in a sanatorium a month prior. It is an unimaginable sequence of events, the profound intimacy of losing his wife to tuberculosis, followed almost immediately by witnessing the most destructive force ever unleashed by humanity. And the jarring part, the detail that makes you question everything about how the human mind actually processes grief, is what he did the very next day, after the bomb, after the death of his wife. This same brilliant, grieving young man is gleefully picking the top secret locks of the U.S. military's most guarded filing cabinets at Los Alamos. He is doing it literally just to mess with the security personnel, leaving little taunting notes inside. You have the architect of mass destruction, the shattered widower, and a mischievous, insubordinate teenager. All converging in one human being at the exact same moment in history. He is widely considered the greatest, most intuitive scientific mind since Albert Einstein. His name is Richard Phillips Feynman. But physics is only half the battle. We are not just reading a timeline of a Nobel laureate today. We are investigating a methodology of living, exploring the agonizing personal tragedies, the fiercely competitive academic rivalries, the wild bohemian escapades, and the incredibly controversial behaviors that define him. If you are drawn to the unvarnished truth of history's greatest figures, hit the like button, subscribe, and share this video. Join us here at Legendary Lives Unveiled, where the shadows of the past are brought into the light. To understand the genius who defied the world's top scientists at Los Alamos and NASA, we must look at the environment that forged that defiance. Back to working-class Far Rockaway, Queens in the 1920s. Born in New York City in 1918 to Melville, a Russian Jewish immigrant, and Lucille, an American-born mother. The early indicators for young Richard were highly unusual. He did not speak a single word until he was 3 years old. Today, a speech delay like that would trigger a whole battery of developmental tests, specialists, perhaps even an autism spectrum evaluation. But back then, he was just considered a late talker. When he finally did start speaking, he developed an incredibly thick working-class New York accent, and he never lost it. Decades later, when he was working alongside the absolute titans of European physics, aristocratic, highly refined intellects like Wolfgang Pauli and Niels Bohr, Pauli actually complained that Feynman sounded like a bum. He sounded like a guy who should be yelling at a cab driver in Manhattan. But instead, He was standing at a chalkboard, completely rewriting quantum electrodynamics. This totally unpretentious nature came directly from his parents. His mother, Lucille, gave him his sharp, irreverent sense of humor. But his father, Melville, who was a sales manager for a uniform company, not a scientist at all, gave him a profound epistemological gift. He taught him the difference between knowing the name of something and knowing how it actually works. Melville was intensely focused on first principles thinking. The biographical material holds a famous story. Young Richard is playing in a field, and another kid points out a bird. The kid knows the bird's name in English, Italian, and Portuguese, really trying to make Richard feel inferior by flexing his vocabulary. When Richard asks his father about it, Melville tells him something that becomes the cornerstone of his entire scientific philosophy. He essentially tells him, "You can know the name of that bird in all the languages of the world. But when you're finished, you'll know absolutely nothing whatever about the bird. You will only know about humans in different places and what they call the bird." Melville told him to look at the bird and see what it's actually doing. Why is it pecking at its feathers? Is it cleaning them? Are there mites? If it's cleaning them, why do birds that just landed peck more than birds that have been walking around? He forced Richard to observe the mechanism, not the label. It taught Feynman that the label society puts on something, whether it's an animal, a physics equation, or a person with a fancy title, is entirely meaningless. This perfectly explains why he had a lifelong allergy to authority. This rebellion against societal labels is most beautifully illustrated in his relationship with his younger sister, Joan. Joan was born 9 years after Richard. The family history here is tragic. A baby brother, Henry, had died at just 4 weeks old before Joan was born. As a result, Richard and Joan formed an incredibly tight, deeply protective sibling bond. They shared an intense, boundless curiosity about the natural world. But they quickly hit a massive societal wall. Their mother, Lucille, held the widely accepted belief of that era that the female brain was simply too delicate, too feeble for complex mathematics and science. She actively discouraged Joan from looking at the stars or studying math. But Richard, armed with that skepticism his father taught him, looked at his sister, looked at the societal rule, and decided the rule was garbage. He became her champion. He would sneak her out of the house at night, out to the local golf course in Far Rockaway, where they would lie on their backs in the grass and just watch the aurora borealis, the northern lights. He treated her as a total intellectual equal. For her 14th birthday, he gave her a gift that was an act of pure rebellion, a dense, mathematical, college-level astronomy book by Robert Horace Baker. Joan later recalled that turning the pages of that book literally changed her life. She saw a figure in the text attributed to a female astronomer, Cecilia Payne-Gaposchkin, the woman who discovered that stars are made primarily of hydrogen and helium. Seeing a woman's name in a college science textbook proved to Joan that the labels her mother and society placed on her were completely false. Joan Feynman went on to become a groundbreaking astrophysicist herself at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. She literally discovered the origin of those very auroras that she and Richard used to watch on the golf course as kids. Richard reportedly once told her they could divide up the universe. He would take Earth, and she could have everything else. It highlights his absolute refusal to accept artificial limitations. However, despite his obvious intellectual horsepower, his own academic path wasn't entirely smooth. When it came time for college, he applied to Columbia University and received a flat rejection. It wasn't because he bombed the entrance exam or had bad grades. The historical records show it was entirely due to Columbia's strict Jewish quotas at the time. They had already met their arbitrary limit for Jewish students, so the future Nobel laureate was denied entry. He went to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, instead. But when evaluating his intellect, we must talk about his IQ score, because this is where conventional metrics of genius completely break down. In high school, Feynman was given a standardized IQ test, and the recorded score was a 125. The man who rewrote the fundamental laws of physics. The man who could outcalculate early computers in his own head. Scored a merely respectable 125. His sister Joan scored a 126, and she spent the rest of her life reminding him she was officially 1 point smarter. Feynman loved to weaponize that fact. He used that 125 score as his perfect passive-aggressive excuse to decline an invitation to join Mensa, writing them a letter stating his IQ was simply too low to qualify. Standard IQ tests measure convergent thinking, how quickly you traverse a maze someone else built to find the single correct answer. But Feynman's genius was entirely divergent. He looked at the maze from above and realized you could just walk over the walls. Just consider his childhood hobby. He ran a radio repair business out of his bedroom. But he wasn't just blindly replacing broken vacuum tubes. He would sit in front of a broken radio, not touching it, sometimes for an hour, just staring. He was visualizing the flow of electricity, tracing the circuit in his mind. He was figuring out the theoretical reason the radio wasn't working before he ever picked up a tool. He was diagnosing invisible forces. And that exact same refusal to accept the expected path naturally bled into his personal life. It was a stubbornness that would lead him directly into the darkest, most agonizing choice of his life as the world went to war. While in graduate school at Princeton, Richard Feynman was deeply in love with his high school sweetheart, Arlene Greenbaum. They were engaged to be married, but Arlene fell ill. It took months of misdiagnoses, which only deepened Feynman's lifelong distrust of medical authority, before she was finally diagnosed with lymphatic tuberculosis. In the early 1940s, before the widespread availability of antibiotics like streptomycin, TB was a horrifying disease. It was highly contagious, and very often a slow, agonizing death sentence. When the diagnosis was confirmed, Feynman's family, particularly his parents, panicked. They begged him to break off the engagement. They were terrified he would catch the disease and die, or that caring for a terminally ill wife would completely derail his promising academic career. It was the logical, rational, self-preserving advice any parent would give. But Feynman did not do logical self-preservation when it conflicted with his personal morality. He ignored his parents. He ignored the medical establishment's warnings about proximity. He married Arlene in a civil ceremony in Staten Island in 1942. The historical detail that twists the knife here. On their way to the ceremony, they had to be careful not to kiss, to avoid transmission. It was an act of profound, almost defiant devotion, but their time together was immediately interrupted. The world was at war, and the United States government recognized that Feynman's mind was a unique asset. He was recruited by J. Robert Oppenheimer to join the Manhattan Project, the top-secret initiative to build the first atomic bomb before Nazi Germany could. He initially hesitated, wanting to stay near Arlene, to focus on his theoretical physics. But the terrifying thought of Hitler possessing a nuclear weapon first convinced him he had to join, so he and Arlene moved to New Mexico. But they could not live together. Feynman went to the secret military laboratory at Los Alamos, isolated high up on a mesa. Arlene was placed in a sanatorium down in Albuquerque, about 100 miles away. They were separated during the week, and he would hitchhike or borrow cars to visit her every single weekend. The biographical sources reveal a darkly ironic detail about these trips. To make the drive down to Albuquerque, Feynman would sometimes borrow a car from a colleague, a quiet, unassuming fellow physicist named Klaus Fuchs. Klaus Fuchs, the man who history later reveals was one of the most devastatingly effective Soviet spies of the entire Cold War. He was passing the deepest atomic secrets straight out of Los Alamos to the KGB, and Richard Feynman was casually borrowing this spy's car to go visit his dying wife. The historical irony is so thick, you could cut it with a knife. Separated during the week, Richard and Arlene wrote to each other constantly. But Los Alamos was a military installation absolutely obsessed with secrecy. Every single piece of mail entering or leaving the base was opened, read, and redacted by military censors. If there is one thing we know about Richard Feynman, it is that if you put an arbitrary rule in front of him, he will make it his life's mission to break it, just to prove he can. The censorship drove them both crazy, so they started using codes. Arlene would send him letters written entirely in invisible ink. Another time, she wrote a letter on a blank jigsaw puzzle, broke it into loose pieces, put them in a bag, and mailed it. Imagine the military censor sitting at a desk, sweating, trying to assemble a jigsaw puzzle to make sure a 25-year-old wasn't leaking nuclear secrets. Furious, the censors intercepted it and sent Feynman a formal stern reprimand. "We do not have time to play games. Please instruct your wife to confine herself to ordinary letters." That rebellious spirit translated perfectly into how he operated within the top-secret confines of Los Alamos. The military had highly secure, heavy iron safes containing the literal blueprints and calculations for the atomic bomb. Whenever he had a spare moment, Feynman taught himself the mechanics of safe cracking. He figured out that factory default combinations were rarely changed, or he would observe the minute mechanical tells of the dials. He wasn't trying to steal secrets. He was trying to expose the vulnerability of the system. He would break into a colleague's safe, read a top-secret document, and leave a little note inside saying, "Guess who?" or "Borrowed document number X." He drove the security personnel absolutely insane. He was a massive nuisance on the perimeter too. He found a hole in the barbed wire fences surrounding the base. He would walk out the main gate, flashing his ID badge to the guard, sneak back in through the hole, and walk out the main gate again. The guards were logging him, leaving the base 3 times without ever seeing him enter. He took up playing bongo drums, wandering out into the woods around the base at night, creating a primitive rhythm echoing over a laboratory, designing the ultimate technological weapon. Yet, amidst all this chaos, he was a junior physicist in his 20s, holding his own with the absolute titans of the field. He became the primary sparring partner for Hans Bethe, the head of the theoretical division. They would lock themselves in an office and literally scream equations at each other. The rest of the staff dubbed them the Mosquito and the Battleship. Bethe was the massive, unstoppable, methodical force of intellect. Feynman was the mosquito, darting around, buzzing in his ear, poking holes in his logic, attacking problems from weird, unorthodox angles. Bethe loved it. He needed someone unintimidated by his reputation. Out of those screaming matches came the Bethe-Feynman formula. This formula was crucial for calculating the explosive yield of a fission weapon. When you compress a core of plutonium or uranium, a chain reaction starts. Neutrons split atoms, releasing more neutrons, splitting more atoms. But the immense heat and pressure immediately push the core apart. Once it expands past a certain point, the chain reaction stops. The bomb blows itself apart before it can finish exploding. The engineering challenge is a literal race between the nuclear reaction trying to happen and the bomb tearing itself to pieces. Their formula allowed scientists to predict the efficiency of that race, how big the explosion would actually be. Without it, the military wouldn't know if they were dropping a city-leveling weapon or an expensive, dirty bomb. The psychological load he was carrying is staggering. Imagine doing the math to calculate the death toll of a doomsday device, surrounded by generals and the greatest scientific minds on the planet, while every weekend you drive 100 miles to watch your 25-year-old wife slowly suffocate from a disease no amount of genius can cure. It creates a cognitive dissonance almost impossible to navigate. It forces a dark reevaluation of the prankster narrative. Was the safe cracking, the lock picking, the bongo drums, and the puzzle letters just the byproduct of a bored, hyperactive mind? Or was it a psychological pressure valve, a desperate coping mechanism? The timeline and intensity of his grief heavily suggest a trauma response. Trapped in a rigid, militarized environment doing grim work, facing a profound personal tragedy over which he had zero control, his mind demanded equilibrium. The safes were a puzzle he could solve. The security rules were boundaries he could manipulate. When the major variables of your life, death, war, are completely out of your hands, you find comfort in mastering the minor variables, even if it means picking a lock just to prove you still have agency. The climax of this period is absolutely devastating. In June 1945, Arlene's condition rapidly deteriorated. Feynman was called to the hospital in Albuquerque. He sat by her bed, holding her hand, watching the clock as she took her final breaths on June 16th. Biographical accounts note that he didn't cry when she died. He kissed her forehead, noted that the smell of her hair hadn't changed, and went to the nurse's station to sign the death certificate. He packed her belongings, arranged for her cremation, and went straight back to work at Los Alamos. Right back to the bomb. Exactly 1 month later, on July 16th, 1945, the Trinity test takes place. The bomb works. Shortly after, the bombs are dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killing hundreds of thousands of people. The war ends. But the adrenaline of the Manhattan Project, the frantic pace that had kept his grief at bay, suddenly evaporated. The psychological walls he had built to survive began to crumble. The delayed grief over Arlene, compounded by the horrifying visceral reality of what the atomic bomb had actually done to human beings in Japan, pushed Feynman into a severe, nihilistic depression. He left Los Alamos and took a professorship at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York. But he arrived as a renowned yet fundamentally broken man. He later described sitting in a restaurant in New York City shortly after the war, looking out the window at people building new construction projects and thinking they were crazy. Convinced that nuclear war was imminent and a bomb would drop on New York at any minute, he felt any human endeavor to build or create was utterly pointless. He was completely untethered. To survive this period, he didn't turn to therapy. Hardly a standard avenue for physicists in the late 1940s anyway. He turned to chaos. The sources paint a picture of an incredibly restless man who refused to put down roots. He wouldn't buy a house or sign a long-term lease. He bounced between guest houses and the spare rooms of colleagues. Because he was a young widower, highly charismatic, suddenly famous, and devoid of traditional boundaries, his personal life became sexually volatile. He aggressively pursued women, including the wives of his faculty colleagues at Cornell, and even his own undergraduate students. This behavior forms a massive, uncomfortable part of his complex legacy. In his wildly popular memoir, Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman, he dedicated a whole chapter to this post-war era, specifically the summer of 1946. He openly writes about holding academic meetings in strip clubs and going to bars with the explicit goal of picking up women, treating the endeavor like a detached sociological experiment. He met a man in a bar who acted as a dark mentor, teaching him highly manipulative, cynical tactics. Never buy a woman a drink, never show her respect, and actively insult her until she agreed to go home with him. Feynman actually writes that, to get into the right headspace, he started calling the women bitches in his own internal monologue. He recounts a specific story about a woman named Anne. She convinced him to buy her sandwiches at a deli, promising they'd eat them at her apartment. When they arrived, she casually mentioned another man, a major, was coming over to visit. Feynman exploded, writing that he told her she was worse than a whore and left. But the punchline he presents is that later that night, she tracked him down at the bar and took him home. To analyze the psychology behind the shock value, what was actually going on in his head? He was treating human interaction the exact same way he treated a physical system in a laboratory. He wanted to understand the underlying mechanics, however grim they might be. If I input a specific insult, do I get a specific behavioral output? He was trying to assert absolute control over his social environment because he had completely lost control over his emotional environment during the war. But when these stories circulated, and when the book was published in 1985, the backlash was severe. In 1968 and 1972, while teaching at Caltech, student groups organized protests against him. They picketed his lectures, holding signs calling him a sexist pig. They objected to his personal history and his teaching style, where he frequently used clueless lady drivers, or women in the kitchen, as the butt of his physics anecdotes. Yet, a typical academic of his era would have become defensive or used their tenure to silence the students. Feynman didn't. His reaction to being protested reveals a stunning contradiction. A refusal to defend his own ego when confronted with the reality of an evolving world. Feynman did not respond to his protesters with the typical defensiveness of a tenured academic. He actually engaged with them. He publicly stated that women do face systemic prejudice and discrimination in physics, and he acknowledged that the protests were a necessary, visible reminder of those difficulties. He declared that society needed to actively remedy them. He even added a caveat at the end of that highly controversial chapter in his memoir, writing, "I never really used it after that. I didn't enjoy doing it that way." But it was interesting to know that things worked much differently from how I was brought up. He viewed his manipulation purely as data collection, seemingly oblivious to the emotional collateral damage he was causing. His personal life remained chaotic for years. He attempted a second marriage in 1952 to a woman named Mary Louise Bell, a spectacular, highly public failure that ended in a very messy divorce. Her legal complaint is legendary in the physics community. She testified under oath that the marriage was intolerable because he did calculus constantly. Her exact words on the public record were, "He begins working calculus problems in his head as soon as he awakens. He did calculus while driving his car, while sitting in the living room, and while lying in bed at night. He was simply consumed by his work." It wasn't until the late 1950s that he finally found stability. He met Gwyneth Howarth, an English woman he encountered in Geneva. They married, had a son named Carl, and adopted a daughter named Michelle. Gwyneth finally provided that emotional anchor that he had been lacking since Arlene's tragic death. But even with a stable family, that bohemian, restless energy never vanished. It just found a new, surreal outlet. This brings us to his friendship with Gerard Zorthian. Zorthian was a Yale-trained Armenian artist who had survived the Armenian genocide as a child. He was eccentric, loud, and lived on a sprawling bazaar property in Altadena, California, right near Caltech, known as the Zorthian Ranch. Constructed out of salvaged wood, discarded telephone poles, and broken concrete, it was an architectural junkyard utopia. Zorthian was famous across Southern California for throwing massive bacchanalian parties, spring festivals with nude nymphs dancing in the hills, jazz legends like Charlie Parker dropping in for jam sessions, and Andy Warhol wandering the grounds. It was the absolute epicenter of the California counterculture. And right in the middle of it all was Richard Feynman, one of the most respected, highly cited theoretical physicists on the planet. He and Zorthian became incredibly close friends and made a fascinating pact. Zorthian agreed to teach Feynman how to draw and paint. And in exchange, Feynman agreed to teach Zorthian the fundamentals of theoretical physics. The physics lessons for Zorthian apparently went nowhere. But the art lessons profoundly transformed Feynman. He threw himself into it with the same obsessive intensity he applied to calculus. He hired nude models to pose in his house, learned portraiture, and became incredibly skilled, to the point where he started submitting his work to local galleries. But he submitted the art under a pseudonym, O'Fay. He didn't want people buying his drawings just because a famous physicist created them. He wanted the work to be judged purely on its own merit. He was completely rejecting the stuffy professor stereotype in a total rock star phase, indulging in sensory extremes like bongo drums, nude sketches, and chaotic parties just to feel alive. Yet, here is the most incredible part of this whole period. This total surrender to chaotic creativity did not distract him from his physics. It became the catalyst for his greatest scientific breakthrough. During this restless post-war period, the most intractable problem in theoretical physics was quantum electrodynamics, or QED. QED is the theory that describes how light and matter interact, explaining the mechanics of how electrons and photons behave and influence each other. It is the underlying theory for almost all of chemistry and atomic physics. But in the late 1940s, the math behind it was fundamentally broken. It was generating infinities. When physicists tried to calculate the probability of an electron moving from point A to point B, the equations required them to account for every possible path the electron could take. In quantum mechanics, it takes all of them. It goes straight, loops in a circle, flies to the edge of the galaxy, and back, all at the same time. When you try to calculate the sum of infinite paths using standard calculus, the answer you get is infinity, which makes no physical sense, as you cannot have infinite mass or infinite charge. The theory was a nightmare of dense, unsolvable integrals. The smartest people in the world were completely paralyzed, staring at chalkboards full of infinities. And Feynman, who was spending his weekends learning to sketch the human form and visualizing the flow of lines and curves, approached this mathematical nightmare visually. He invented what we now call Feynman diagrams. Instead of grinding through unworkable algebra, he created a visual shorthand. You draw a straight line to represent a matter particle, like an electron. You draw a wavy line to represent a force-carrying particle, like a photon. And you draw a vertex, a point where the lines intersect, to represent an interaction, like an emission or absorption of a photon. Every single component of that simple drawing corresponded to a specific, highly complex mathematical expression. The lines represented propagators, mathematical functions describing the particle's movement. The vertices represented coupling constants. By drawing the diagram, Feynman organized the terms of a massive, chaotic mathematical equation visually, allowing physicists to see which parts canceled each other out and which were relevant. This allowed them to bypass the infinities through a process called renormalization. He turned the most abstract, brain-melting math in the universe into a schematic diagram. It revolutionized physics overnight. Physicists didn't have to spend 6 months solving one integral. They could draw a few diagrams on a napkin at a conference and intuitively grasp subatomic interactions. It was an entirely new language for nature, invented by a man who had taught himself to think visually. That visual language ultimately won him the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1965, which he shared with Julian Schwinger and Shinichiro Tominaga, who had solved the math using more traditional, agonizingly complex methods. True to his anti-authoritarian nature, Feynman deeply resented winning the Nobel, famously calling it a pain in the neck. He hated the ceremony, the tuxedo, and the fame. Feeling the prize turned science into a status competition rather than a pure pursuit of discovery. He just wanted to figure things out. He didn't want the crown. But winning that Nobel Prize set the stage for a bitter, decades-long rivalry at Caltech. There was one other physicist roaming the hallways who could match Feynman's intellect, blow for blow: Murray Gell-Mann. The contrast between them was fascinating. If Feynman was the chaotic, bongo-playing bohemian who sounded like a Queen's cab driver, Murray Gell-Mann was the structured, highly refined, classically educated polymath. Gell-Mann was a prodigy who entered Yale at 15, loved birdwatching, antiquities, and linguistics. The kind of man who would interrupt a conversation to correct your pronunciation of an obscure French word. They occupied offices down the hall from each other for decades. Despite their massive personality clash, they collaborated on incredibly important work. Most notably, the VA theory of weak interactions, which described the fundamental force responsible for radioactive decay. But the collaboration blew up publicly over Feynman's relentless myth-making. In the first edition of his best-selling memoir, Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman, Feynman tells the story of discovering this VA theory. He writes that it was the first and only time in his entire life that he knew a law of nature that nobody else in the world knew, painting a romantic picture of the solitary genius on a mountaintop of discovery. Murray Gell-Mann was absolutely apoplectic. He threatened to sue Feynman for libel because the objective truth was that Gell-Mann had been working on the exact same theory at the exact same time down the hall, and they had literally discussed it. Furthermore, two other brilliant physicists, George Sudarshan and Robert Marshak, had actually developed the theory independently and published it before either of them. Feynman was taking sole credit for something deeply collaborative. Feynman was forced to back down, and the publisher issued a correction. In later editions, a parenthetical note was added where Feynman casually admits finding out later that at least Murray Gell-Mann and also Sudarshan and Marshak had worked out the same theory didn't spoil my fun. Gell-Mann famously complained that Feynman spent way too much time generating anecdotes about himself. But what balances the scales of his massive ego is observing how Feynman reacted when his actual science was proven wrong. His loyalty to the unvarnished truth of nature always superseded his pride. In the 1960s, Gell-Mann proposed a revolutionary idea that protons and neutrons were made of smaller fractional particles he whimsically named quarks. Feynman absolutely hated the quark model. He stubbornly pushed his own alternative model, arguing the inside of a proton was an undifferentiated soup of particles he called partons. Feynman felt the quark model was too elegant to be real. In the late 60s and 70s, experiments at the Stanford Linear Accelerator Center fired high-energy electrons into protons to settle the debate. The data came back definitively. There were distinct hard points of charge inside the proton. Gell-Mann's quark model was correct. Feynman's parton model was wrong. How did the ego-driven Feynman handle being publicly defeated by his biggest rival? He bowed to nature. When experiments proved a fifth type of quark existed, Feynman didn't sulk or spin the data. He stood up at a conference and enthusiastically predicted that a sixth quark would soon be found to balance the equations, which it eventually was. He conceded to Gell-Mann immediately because the experimental data demanded it. He believed truth was determined by experiment, not by who told the best story. It was this exact dedication to the unvarnished truth that led him to spend a decade trying to resign from the National Academy of Sciences. He hated that elite institution, realizing they spent most of their time just voting on which other scientists were smart enough to join their club. To him, science wasn't a country club. It was the brutal, glorious pursuit of reality, and that obsessive dedication to the truth, regardless of who it offended or how much bureaucracy it disrupted, would culminate on the world stage in 1986, during one of America's darkest, most traumatizing moments in space exploration. January 28, 1986. The Space Shuttle Challenger lifts off from Cape Canaveral, 73 seconds into the flight. A plume of fire appears on the solid rocket booster. The external fuel tank detonates. The shuttle is torn apart, killing all 7 astronauts on board, including Krista McAuliffe, a schoolteacher. The entire nation watches it happen on live television. It is a profound, indelible national trauma. President Ronald Reagan immediately forms a presidential commission, the Rogers Commission, to investigate the cause of the disaster, and they ask Richard Feynman to join. Context is critical here. By 1986, Feynman is in his late 60s, and he is incredibly sick. He is battling not one, but 2 rare, aggressive forms of cancer: liposarcoma, a massive tumor in his abdomen, and Waldenstrom's macroglobulinemia, a cancer of the bone marrow. He has undergone brutal surgeries. He is physically weak. His kidneys are failing. He initially, flat out, refuses the government's invitation. He hates Washington, D.C., despises bureaucratic committees, and knows he does not have much time left to live. Why spend his final month sitting in stuffy hearing rooms? It was his wife, Gwyneth, who changed his mind. She knew him better than anyone. She told him that if he didn't go, the commission would just be a bunch of politicians, NASA managers, and corporate executives protecting their own interests and covering their tracks. She told him, "If you don't do it, there will be 12 people, all in a group, going around from place to place together. But if you join the commission, there will be 11 people, all in a group, going around from place to place together, while the 12th one runs around all over the place, checking all kinds of unusual things." She knew he couldn't resist a puzzle that people were trying to hide, so he packs his bags and goes to Washington, and almost immediately, he goes to war with the commission chairman, William P. Rogers. Rogers, a former Secretary of State, wants a neat, orderly, highly controlled investigation that protects NASA's reputation and doesn't upset the American public further. He sets up a schedule of polite, scripted hearings with NASA top brass. Feynman ignores the schedule entirely. He refuses to sit in the hearing room, listening to PowerPoint presentations. Rogers actually complains to Neil Armstrong, who is also on the commission, that Feynman is becoming a massive pain in the ass. Because Feynman is reverting to his Los Alamos tactics. He is sneaking off the reservation. He rents a car, drives out to the NASA contractor facilities, and goes straight down to the assembly floors. He bypasses the slick PR managers and talks directly to the ground-level engineers, the mechanics, the people who actually turn the wrenches on the shuttle boosters. It is like a building inspector, ignoring the CEO's glossy brochure and walking straight into the basement with a flashlight to check the concrete foundation. What he uncovers in that metaphorical basement is a terrifying, systemic failure of communication. NASA management had been testifying to Congress and the public that the risk of a catastrophic failure on the shuttle was about 1 in 100,000. They were essentially claiming you could launch it every day for 3 centuries without an accident. But when Feynman sat down with the engineers at Morton Thiokol, the company that built the solid rocket boosters, they told him a completely different story. The engineers knew the real odds of failure were closer to 1 in 100. They knew the hardware was flawed. They had repeatedly warned management that the shuttle was dangerous, but their concerns were systematically silenced or buried in paperwork to keep the launch schedule moving and the congressional funding flowing. The specific hardware flaw that caused the explosion was the O-rings. These were massive, incredibly thick rubber seals designed to prevent hot, high-pressure gas from escaping the joints of the solid rocket boosters. And here is where we get a really fascinating, almost spy thriller detail. Feynman gets the public credit for the discovery, but there was an underground network feeding him the information. Another commission member, Air Force General Donald Kutina, had formed a bond with Feynman because they both despised the bureaucratic posturing. Kutina had been secretly tipped off about the O-rings by an active NASA astronaut, Sally Ride. Sally Ride, the first American woman in space. She was on the commission too, but as an active NASA employee, she was in a perilous position. She had quietly obtained internal NASA test results showing that the rubber O-rings became dangerously stiff and lost their ability to seal when the temperature dropped below freezing. Ride couldn't break ranks without destroying her career and facing massive retaliation. So she quietly handed the data to Kutina. Kutina realized he needed a wild card. He needed someone completely immune to NASA's political pressure. Someone who didn't care about their reputation in Washington. He needed Feynman. But Kutina couldn't just hand him the document, or it would look like a coordinated leak. So he subtly guided him toward the answer. He invited Feynman over to his house for dinner. They went out to the garage, where Kutina was restoring an old car. Kutina casually pointed to the carburetor and asked an innocent-sounding question. "Professor, what happens to the rubber seals in this engine when it gets really cold?" Feynman's divergent brain snapped up the bait immediately. He started pulling the thread. He looked at the weather data for the morning of the Challenger launch. The temperature at Cape Canaveral had dropped to 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Freezing. Drastically colder than any previous launch in shuttle history. Feynman realized that if the massive rubber O-ring froze and stiffened, it wouldn't expand to seal the joint when the rocket ignited. Hot, highly pressurized gas from the rocket propellant would leak through the tiny gap like a blowtorch, burning straight into the massive external fuel tank. He understood the physical mechanics of the disaster, but he also understood the political mechanics of Washington. He knew that if he simply wrote an equation about rubber resilience, Chairman Rogers and the NASA bureaucrats would bury it under hundreds of pages of technical jargon. Nobody would read it. He needed a way to communicate the truth that could not be censored, ignored, or spun by PR. He decided to perform a physics experiment on live national television. It happens during a televised public hearing of the commission. A senior NASA manager is on the witness stand, giving highly technical, evasive testimony about acceptable risk margins. Feynman sits quietly at his desk. He has secretly procured a small piece of the actual rubber O-ring material and a small metal C-clamp from a hardware store. He asks for a glass of ice water. 32 degrees. The exact temperature of the launch pad on the morning of the disaster. While the NASA manager is droning on, is trying to obfuscate the truth, Feynman compresses the thick rubber in the C-clamp. He drops it into the glass of ice water sitting on his desk. He waits a few minutes, letting the cold penetrate the material, and then he interrupts the hearing. He hits the microphone button. He pulls the dripping rubber out of the ice water and unscrews the C-clamp. He holds it up for the cameras. The rubber does not spring back to its original shape. It stays compressed, rigid, and stiff. In front of millions of viewers, without using a single complex mathematical equation, he proves that the seal failed. He says, "I discovered that when you undo the clamp, the rubber doesn't spring back." In other words, for more than a few seconds, there is no resilience in this particular material when it is at a temperature of 32 degrees. I believe that has some significance for our problem. It is the ultimate mic drop. He took an engineering failure that killed 7 people and explained it so simply that a child could understand it, completely castrating NASA's elaborate cover-up in real time. When it came time to draft the final official commission report, the committee, led by Rogers, still wanted to soften the blow. They wanted to conclude that NASA needed some management improvements, but was fundamentally doing a fine job. They wanted to protect the institution. Feynman flat out refused to sign it. He told them he would completely remove his name from the entire document, invalidating the commission's credibility, unless his own blistering, unedited 10-page critique of NASA's toxic safety culture was included in full. Terrified of the public relations nightmare of Richard Feynman loudly denouncing their findings to the press, the commission finally caved. They included his independent report, but buried it at the very back of the document as Appendix F. But burying it didn't work. Appendix F became the most read, most famous part of the entire investigation. It ends with a sentence that serves as the thesis statement for Feynman's entire existence. For successful technology, reality must take precedence over public relations, for nature cannot be fooled. Nature cannot be fooled. The exact same young man who picked the top-secret locks at Los Alamos had become the dying elder statesman who cracked open NASA's bureaucratic cover-up. You can spin the press, you can lie to Congress, but you cannot negotiate with the laws of physics. If the rubber is cold, it will fail. Nature doesn't care about your launch schedule. While he was fighting this incredibly consequential battle in Washington, and simultaneously fighting the cancers rapidly destroying his body, Feynman was engaged in a bizarre, highly whimsical, decade-long quest back home. The quest to reach Tannu Tuva. It started years earlier, in 1977, sitting around the dinner table with his close friend and drumming partner, a math teacher named Ralph Layton. Feynman recalled these strange, diamond-shaped postage stamps he used to collect as a kid in far Rockaway, from a place called Tannu Tuva. They pulled out an atlas and found it. A small, obscure, mountainous Soviet republic, located deep in Central Asia, sandwiched right between the frozen expanse of Siberia and the plains of Mongolia. Feynman looked closely at the map, found the capital city of Tuva, and saw that it was spelled Kyzyl, Kyzyl. He said to Layton, "A place whose capital is spelled with no standard vowels must be deeply interesting. We absolutely have to go there." This was the height of the Cold War. Tuva was essentially a closed region. It was practically impossible for a normal American citizen to get a visa, let alone Richard Feynman, one of the primary scientists who built the American atomic bomb. The KGB was not about to let him wander around a sensitive region near the Chinese border. But for 10 long years, while he was winning awards and fighting cancer, Feynman and Layton treated getting to Tuva like a giant geopolitical physics problem. They bypassed standard diplomatic channels. They found a rare Tuvan Russian dictionary and painstakingly translated letters into broken Tuvan. sending them directly to local Soviet institutes. They discovered Tuvan throat singing, an incredible ancient vocal technique where a single singer manipulates their vocal cords to produce 2 or 3 distinct harmonic pitches simultaneously. They got hold of bootleg cassette tapes and blasted this unearthly music through Feynman's house in Pasadena. The joy of the Tuva project wasn't necessarily about setting foot in Kaisel. The joy was in the puzzle itself. It was the thrill of deciphering the bureaucratic red tape, learning the phonetic structure of a dead language, and figuring out the biomechanics of how a human throat can produce 2 notes at once. You have this dying man, arguably the most famous physicist in the world, spending his final days sitting in his living room, struggling to breathe, trying to learn throat singing, and plotting how to sneak into a forgotten corner of Mongolia because of a stamp he saw when he was 10 years old. He maintained the pure, undiluted, playful curiosity of a child his entire life. Tragically, he never made it to Tuva. The cancer finally overtook his body. On February 15, 1988, Richard Feynman died at the UCLA Medical Center in Los Angeles. He was 69 years old, and the heartbreaking, almost novelistic irony of the story is that just a few weeks after his death, a letter arrived in his mailbox. The Soviet government, undergoing the reforms of perestroika, had finally granted them the visas. He missed it by weeks, but he faced his death with the exact same irreverent, observant spirit that he lived his life. His final recorded words, spoken to his family just before he slipped into a coma, were, "I'd hate to die twice. It's so boring." Even in the act of dying, his mind was observing the process and critiquing it for lack of stimulation. He truly believed that the world was infinitely interesting, a puzzle box waiting to be opened if you just looked closely enough and discarded the labels that everyone else accepted. Which brings us to a final, slightly uncomfortable paradox. Feynman was a man who worshipped the objective, unvarnished truth of nature. Yet, he spent his entire adult life actively crafting an elaborate, heavily embellished mythological persona of himself. The ultimate champion of objective physical truth was simultaneously a master storyteller who was never above polishing his own personal legend, sometimes at the expense of his colleagues' contributions. Did his carefully crafted persona help democratize and popularize science, inspiring millions of everyday people? Or did that larger-than-life persona ultimately distract from the real, messy, deeply collaborative reality of how scientific progress is actually achieved? Can you ever truly separate the brilliant salesman from the brilliance of the science? It is a profound contradiction to mull over. If you enjoyed peeling back the layers of this fascinating, contradictory, and staggering genius with us today, please hit the like button, subscribe, and share this audio with a friend. It really helps the channel grow, and we have plenty more incredible stories waiting for you right here at Legendary Lives Unveiled. Keep questioning the world around you. Always look past the labels, and we'll see you next time.